Hello and welcome to TMI with Aldous Tyler for Friday, February 2nd, 2024, coming to you as always from beautiful Madison, Wisconsin. And one of the things that I take great delight in doing this program is checking out not just the media that I critique frequently, but making sure that you're aware of the media that's out there that's good. That's, that you can then know that you can tune in or stream to actually get viewpoints that, at least in my opinion, are definitely worth checking out. Towards that end, one of my own personal heroes in the media, Peter B. Collins, has a website full of archives, good stuff, and I'm very happy to bring him on to the show today so we can talk about it. Peter, welcome back to TMI.
Aldous, it's always great to talk with you, and you, of course, played a central role in my syndicated radio efforts, helping with nonstop radio to keep us on the air at times when that was threatened. So I have fond recollections of Mr. Tyler.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where, again, I want to make sure people have access to quality media, and in that phase of my media activism, I was making sure that the broadcast airwaves had places so you could actually hear an alternative point of view to the standard corporate-centered or right-wing stuff that was just everywhere.
Well, we tried to change the media starting in 2004 with the launch of Air America.
Uh-huh.
And that same year, a couple of other people and I bought a radio station in Monterey, California, to serve as a platform to host and originate other progressive talk shows, including the one that I hosted. And it was a difficult ride because Air America was an entity that failed both as a business and in terms of really building a serious audience. And the achievements of Air America were that Rachel Maddow got on MSNBC and Al Franken was elected to the Senate. Beyond that, they fleeced a lot of investors. They had a business model that did not work. And when the George W. Bush mega recession hit at the end of 2008, it all pretty well collapsed. And at that point, I moved into podcasting. I had a nice run there, 12 years, developed an audience in 71 countries that it surprised me when Google gave me those data points. And then I retired at the end of 2020, a little bit exhausted by Trump and COVID.
That's a 1-2 punch right there.
It was hard. I found it kind of depressing to do a daily show talking about the news when so much of it was really dark and twisted around Trump's narcissistic needs.
Yes, indeed. I know that my listeners will know just from listening to me that I don't actually speak about Trump that much because one of the aims of my particular program, of course, is to give an alternative to what's out there to make sure that if something's being ignored or just getting distorted, that's where it's on my radar. So Trump is anything but ignored. So usually he's not a frequent topic. Now, the effects of the policies that he put into place, oh yes, that's all over the place because while Trump himself, as like a media darling, if you will, is just everywhere, a lot of the things that went on, thanks to the policies his administration carried out, weren't actually that well reported.
Well, it's true. And, it's kind of hard to describe this in retrospect because the corporate media went into a deep dive on what became known as Russiagate. And based on my own original reporting with whistleblowers, particularly from the intelligence community, I didn't buy into that. And it became really weird because if you criticized the coverage of Russiagate, you were then perceived as some sort of an enabler of Trump. And, to me, the mainstream media and, most notably the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC, they really, they had a very negative impact on journalism. And they fed the notion that Trump was so eager to stoke that it was all fake news. And to be fair, much of the reporting about the allegations that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, that Russia hacked the Democratic National Committee servers, that Russia then gave the data that they stole to WikiLeaks, that wasn't true. And Sean Henry was the former FBI cybersecurity guy who was the vice president of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike was the company hired by the DNC to essentially support the claim that Russia had been using cybercrime to try to defeat Hillary Clinton. And Sean Henry admitted under oath in a hearing conducted by Adam Schiff, who is now leading candidate for the Senate seat that was vacated by the over-the-hill Dianne Feinstein last year. He asked Sean Henry point blank, when did you learn that information was taken from the DNC server by Russian cyber operatives? And he said, well, Mr. Schiff, we don't have any evidence that anything, and he used the term exfiltrated, that any data were exfiltrated from the DNC. Yep. And let's just put a button on that one for a moment. There was foreign interference in the 2016 election that is demonstrable. And it came from the state of Israel. And it occurred on an overt and on a covert track. The overt track was that over the objections of President Obama, that Republicans invited Benjamin Netanyahu to come to Washington first to do a victory lap at AIPAC, and then to address a joint session of Congress, in which Netanyahu, not quite explicitly, tipped his hand in favor of Donald Trump. Then, starting in July, Netanyahu invited Trump to Israel for what was almost a full state visit. And then Netanyahu assigned his minister without portfolio to make contact with members of the Trump campaign team, including Roger Stone, including, if I recall correctly, Don Trump Jr. And they repeatedly offered to deliver dirt on Hillary Clinton to the Trump campaign. Now, you may say, well, here's this retired left progressive wacko who's just making shit.
Oh, well.
Well,
yeah.
The information that I'm citing came from an FBI report. The FBI made these statements as the result of a lawsuit brought by major media outlets, CNN, Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post. And those outlets sanitized the FBI reporting and basically just whitewashed the whole thing.
Yep.
And my source for that is the Israeli newspaper called Haaretz. And to this day, if you go to the Haaretz website, and search for FBI 2016 Trump, Netanyahu, something like that, you will find that information. You could also go to peterbcollins.com and go into the search window of my site, and you'll see a number of podcasts from 2016 and 2017 where I cover these issues.
Yep.
And so we have had a media in this country that has not only declined because of budget cuts and, the loss of profitability of local newspapers, but has intentionally put its finger on the scale repeatedly to present the news in a way that fed certain narratives, whether they were true or not.
Right. And the thing that I want to make sure to mention for our viewers and listeners here is that, and I appreciate the fact that you first went and told people where they could find the sources that you're talking about, because that's one of the reasons why I always tried to keep track of what you were up to, because I knew that generally if I went to peterbcollins.com, I would be finding podcasts and such that were actually sourced from real, media, properly credentialed things. We're talking about stuff, as you said, this is first source stuff from FBI investigations. That this isn't just hearsay. And I always appreciated the fact that you were more than happy to let people in on where you found the information from. You were not just simply going to bloviate on a particular topic, unless, of course, you had some backing for it. So
I've been accused of bloviating, and I'll plead guilty.
Well, right, but structured and backed bloviating. That's the important part. You got to make sure that if you're going to start on that you got a basis for it, and you always did. Now, one of the things that was always brought to mind by me was that basically when it came down to the 2016 election, it always seemed to me that the problem was that nobody in the Hillary campaign wanted to admit publicly that the problem was they had a candidate that just wasn't that popular, and that was the primary problem. But when it came down to actually having something they could blame or point at, they realized that wouldn't play well. The last thing any major American politician wants to do is to point the finger at Israel and say, yeah, they're screwing me. So, yeah, I could see where that was a big conundrum. So, of course, Russia, very convenient target.
Well, and let's look at this over a longer time frame, because and let me single out Rachel Maddow once again, because back at the time that she was a host on Air America and I was doing my syndicated program, I encountered her a few times at these group events where we had a radio row. And I respect her, and I think that she has grown into becoming a major presence in American media. But back in 2006, 2007, when I first met Rachel, she did a 1-hour news report every day on Air America, where she was a sharp critic of the Bush wars.
Yes,
and
indeed.
in particular, the occupation of Iraq. And so she built a media fan base, a following, on that aspect of her persona. She was clearly anti-Bush and anti-war. As we move forward through the teen years, and as Russiagate became an obsession with her, and she has misreported many, many, many issues related to Russiagate and never once issued an apology or a correction. And she brought her viewers along to become the Democratic pro-war party, to, cheer on the conflict with Ukraine, and to always personalize Russia as Putin. Putin this, Putin that, Putin everything. Now, I want to be clear, I don't support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Rachel Maddow was silent when Barack Obama sat on his hands when Putin and Russia annexed Crimea in 2014.
Yep.
And Rachel Maddow has never honestly reported the nature of the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, which was led by a corrupt man named Yanukovych. They repeatedly mischaracterized him as pro-Russian. And Paul Manafort, who's that weird guy who volunteered to serve as Trump's campaign manager at zero pay in 2016, he had contracts with oligarchs in Ukraine. He was trying to steer Ukraine toward the West, toward NATO, toward the European Union. And when Victoria Nuland, who is still part of the Democratic diplomatic apparatus at the State Department, she was caught on tape scheming to overthrow Yanukovych and gaming to figure out who would replace him. And they found this guy, Poroshenko. No, Petro Poroshenko.
Gotcha.
And he was installed with the U.S. blessing. And so we had an agreement with Ukraine dating back to the Clinton era that if Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons, that we would be there to protect it in the future. Now, I'm not trying to rewrite history entirely here because Obama made his call and it didn't really challenge the Russian expansion. And my real point here is that if you look at where Rachel Maddow was in 2006, 2007, and how much she shifted after getting the, insider treatment when she would go to Afghanistan and interview the generals of this failed mission and talk about it like, this is a glorious American undertaking. We've liberated this country. Well, she really became a part of the, military industrial media complex.
Yes, indeed.
An apologist for it. And so today, you won't hear her. Well, first of all, she doesn't cover foreign news much at all. She tries to avoid it. But she just falls right into line without asking any questions about, how much should we support Ukraine? How much more money should we put in there into a corrupt government that is in the news again this week for, millions of dollars that were pocketed by people from money that came from the U.S. and from European allies. And it's a complicated picture. Again, I don't really want to see Russia win this conflict, but we have to be realistic about what the U.S. can do without getting into a direct war with Russia or committing NATO to a direct war with Russia. And Joe Biden never talks about this. And while I don't support the way Republicans, particularly in the House, hold Biden's policies hostage, whether it's the border, Ukraine, or shoveling more money at Israel, there are legitimate questions that the Republicans have tried to ask. They've asked for an audit of the money that has been paid to and sent to Ukraine. And the Democrats just, stonewall it. The Republicans have asked for a mission statement. What exactly are we doing in Ukraine? And do we have an achievable goal there? And I would submit at this point that the stalemate is pretty clear. And we know from independent media, not from corporate media, that there were several efforts by Russia through third parties to engage in negotiations with Ukraine. And at one point, Boris Johnson, the guy with the bad hair who was the prime minister in England, he went over and told Zelensky, you can't talk to them. And do you notice that we never get any kind of accurate death toll on how many Ukrainians, military and civilian, who've been killed in this conflict? We get homer coverage. We're the home team. And we cheer on Ukraine because it's not Russia. But it's a proxy war, and hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many, but it is in the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died. And what is the price? And who gets to determine that? Now, these are big questions that are not being dealt with by our government, either party, are not really being addressed in the media. And now we have this conflict between Hamas and Israel, where the same playbook is being used. We're on the home team. We've got to cheer for Israel.
Oh, yes.
Bill Maher shuts down any other discussion on his show and just says, I'm for Team Israel.
Well, Bill Maher's historically is a humongous Islamophobe, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah. But the issue is, what is America's interest? And now we have the Houthis who are attacking shipping traffic. We have the bombing of a base that no American even knew about, that is on the border of Jordan and Syria. And we're, in all of these episodes, the propaganda is that these are Iranian-backed militias and fighting forces. And this opens the door for super hawks like Nikki Haley to demand direct attacks by the United States on Iran.
Yeah, which would be a horrible
That's what
idea.
Israel has been trying to get us to do for years.
Oh, yes. But, realistically speaking, if you ever, look at the strength of forces that Iran has, that's a horrible idea. They're not weaklings. Iran is a very militarily strong country. It would be nothing like us rolling into Iraq, in as much as the sheer amount of forces and weaponry and personnel at Iran's disposal is just, it would make what we faced with Saddam look like nothing.
Yeah, I agree. And people are not thinking they're really operating in a tribal manner. It is stoked by our media that gives us partial and often misleading information. And let me just rant about one more recent set of issues. Starting with the McCarthyite hearing, where Elise Stefanik grandstanded with the 3 female university presidents. We have seen the freedom of speech enjoyed by Americans sharply curtailed when it comes to criticism of the policies of the State of Israel. To do so is labeled both anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas.
Yep.
And I support human rights. I support the right of the Palestinian civilians to live without being herded by Israel along the Gaza Strip, told that you'll be safe in the southern part, only to face bombing and ground attacks from Israeli forces all over the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm.
And when we call for a ceasefire, oh, you're hurting people in America. You are anti-Semitic. You are ill-informed or ignorant. And so we have seen the media join forces with propagandists to narrow the rights of expression and even try to dictate the thinking of American citizens who aren't committing any crime. They simply hold a point of view that is different. So this led to the courageous move by South Africa, where the term apartheid was coined, really,
Mm-hmm.
and where Israel supported the apartheid government until it fell apart.
Right.
And Israel is now on a high horse denouncing South Africa for having the temerity to bring charges of genocide before the World Court.
Mm-hmm.
And how can we view the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, the, double imprisonment of more than 2 million people who can be herded like cattle
Mm-hmm.
at the whim of the IDF, who are being starved, denied medical care, whose homes have been destroyed, and yet they are penned in. Egypt won't accept them.
Yeah.
They have nowhere to go.
And yeah,
that meets the terms of genocide,
mm-hmm.
but Israel claims, well, we own the definition of genocide because of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And for me, that's even more troubling, because to sully the history of the Holocaust, which is something that I care about very deeply.
Mm-hmm.
My father took me and my brothers to Dachau, the German death camp, when I was 12. And so I yield to no one on the depths of depravity of the Holocaust. But to then say that that was a genocide, but what Israel is doing in Gaza is not, that is a kind of selective definition and a selective outrage. So we have this decision from the World Court, which orders Israel to stop genocidal activities and expression. And what emerges the next day? It's a propaganda initiative from Israel claiming that the UN Human Rights Agency that ministers to the people in Gaza, they are accusing them with almost no evidence. Okay.
Uh-huh.
They're saying that 12 out of 13,000 UN employees in Gaza may have had some participation in the events of October 7th.
So to be clear, less than 1/1000th of the total personnel.
Yes. And they have been permitted to make these charges, to force the U.S. and other countries to at least temporarily suspend funding for the refugee crisis that has been created in Gaza,
Uh-huh.
on the basis of allegations. And even it's been 4 days, as you and I are now speaking, since the charges were leveled by Israel. They've said that 2 people actively crossed the perimeter into Israel, and allegedly, we don't know their names, we don't have any details on where these events may have occurred, but they are alleged to have taken 1 or more hostages from Israel to Gaza. So that's 2 of the 12.
Right.
The other 10 are described as Hamas sympathizers. Now, I'm sorry, this has been a protracted conflict between Israel and Hamas, and there are many people in Gaza who are Hamas sympathizers.
Well, yes.
They are not necessarily armed militants. They may not know where the tunnels are or where the leaders are or anything about it.
Uh-huh.
But when you are locked down on a collective punishment basis, just for being Palestinian and just for living in Gaza, it's hard to not have some sympathy for the only entity, Hamas, that is attempting to throw off your oppressor.
Well, and I would like to point out one more time on the proportion. Given the context you're giving, yes, it's one of those things where it's like, why would you be surprised that a significant portion wouldn't be describable as a Hamas sympathizer? But to be clear, it's not a sizable proportion. Less than 1/10 of 1%. Less than 1/10 of 1% of the UN forces that we're talking about, the UN, of people that we're talking about, have been accused of this at all. That's not even that's not a significant proportion in any way, shape, or form.
So, and I'll just add with a source, I encourage people to go to the Gray Zone. That's Max Blumenthal's website. He does excellent reporting. And I would encourage you also to go to my archives. I've done a number of interviews with Max over the years, and he has covered the previous conflicts between Israel and Hamas. And the proportion of deaths on each side in those previous conflicts going back to roughly 2006 was about 12-1. Israel would kill 12 Palestinians for each Israeli who died.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Blumenthal and his colleagues have done careful research into the death count that Israel released from October 7th. It started at 1,400.
Uh-huh.
It's now described as about 1,200.
Uh-huh.
What the Gray Zone shows is that they have confirmed deaths of about 337 Israeli civilians.
Uh-huh.
And this number this is limited to October 7th and let's say 2 days after, right?
Right.
There were about 370 Israeli troops who were killed. So that's less than 800 Israelis by factual data that's publicly available.
Right.
Now, any loss of life is deplorable.
Mm-hmm.
Civilians who are caught at a music festival or just waking up at a kibbutz, these are innocent people.
Right.
And I don't in any way rationalize or justify their killing.
Right.
But we're now at over 25,000 Palestinians who've been killed in Gaza since October 8th. And some of those are definitely Hamas fighters and Hamas sympathizers.
Right.
But it's not the vast majority. The vast majority are children.
Yeah.
And, in the days after October 7th, this report surfaced that Hamas fighters had beheaded babies when they invaded Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't a single shred of evidence to support that.
Not a thing. And I know
it's a scurrilous lie.
Yeah, and I know that Joe Biden himself repeated that particular thing, that had disturbed him very much. And then it came out, if you were looking at all the various sources from the theater of operations, that, that didn't happen.
Well, and not only that, Aldous, again, citing the Gray Zone, they're reporting based on Israeli accounts is that on October 7th, many Israelis were killed by Israeli forces. That there were helicopter attacks, there were fighter jets, there were tanks that fired shells into the kibbutzim, and there were innocent Israelis who were killed as they attempted to recover their footing after being surprised by the Hamas attack, which we now know Israel had the plans for at least a year before it happened.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going to put this as a question because I don't have enough information to go further. But it's a legitimate question. Did Israel, having the Hamas battle plans for a year in advance, did they intentionally ignore that threat so that the bloodthirsty extremists in the Netanyahu cabinet, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a man who has been accused of a number of crimes in the past, and Ben-Gvir holds 2 cabinet posts in the Netanyahu government, and he oversees the West Bank and the security forces along the Gaza border. And so, did they permit this to happen? To create the casus belli to level Gaza and to conduct this incredible operation with so much loss of innocent human life. And we know that Ben-Gvir was leading an effort in the West Bank through the entire year of 2023. Hundreds of West Bank Palestinians were killed by settlers and by Israeli forces. And just today, the news is that Israeli forces, some of whom were wearing hijabs and clothing to present themselves as Palestinians, they raided a hospital in the West Bank, and they shot and killed 3 men who they say were Hamas fighters. Now, we don't have enough information to say whether this was justified or not, but they released the video of this raid, and CNN is playing it. And the implication is that if Israel asserts that these were terrorists, and that's the label that CNN used as I was watching an hour ago, there's no due process. It's not like, oh, we're going to arrest these people, accuse them of being Hamas fighters, and bring them to justice.
No.
They raided the hospital, which is a violation of international law, and they shot and killed them at point-blank range.
Pat, and on top of that, because of the use of disguise, if you will, to attempt to make their own forces appear to be potentially Hamas or Palestinian to begin with, I don't know, the video itself is, of course, just going to be very misleading by itself without any kind of context. Peter, I just wanted to let you know that the big reason I wanted to have you on here was simply to make sure that my listeners and viewers know that they can get the kind of insightful analysis that we've been able to expose them to just now. If they check out peterbcollins.com, you've got just years of archives on there of this kind of thing, and not just Israel, not just Ukraine, but in all sorts of different topics that are of vital importance. And I wanted to be sure that people understood this is a real resource that I myself have used. pdbcolumns.com is. And I just wanted to make sure that people knew how to find it. And thanks to the conversation you and I have been able to have, I think they got an excellent example of what they can hear there.
Well, Aldous, I appreciate it. The website was offline for silly software reasons for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank my former webmaster, John Gorenfeld, who moved to London 5 years ago, for taking the time to get under the hood and fix it. And I just want to point out one other podcast that is on the website that is no longer available on YouTube. Just before I retired, I did an interview with Greg Palast,
Mm-hmm.
and we talked in detail about his work covering the election rigging in the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg has done incredible reporting on this.
I've had Greg on here as well. He's a friend of the program.
Yeah. So he and I did one of my final podcasts before I retired. And at the time, all of my shows were on my website and various outlets, including YouTube. Well, a year and a half later, I got a notice from YouTube that they had removed this podcast because they said that it contributed to misinformation about the presidential election of 2020. And what we reported was the purging of the voter rolls that
Right.
Brad Raffensperger,
Perjure.
whatever.
Yeah, he prefers. I know Greg is
Yeah.
very clear that it's Brad Raffensperger.
Yeah. So Raffensperger, before the election of 2020, purged hundreds of thousands of people off the voting rolls in Georgia. Then, when he had no choice but to rebuff Trump's request on January 3rd of 2021 to find me 11,780 some votes,
Mm-hmm.
because it was too late. It wasn't that Raffensperger wouldn't have done that, 3 months before.
Right, but
at that point, Trump was just being ridiculous. There was
Right.
no way that Georgia officials could suddenly produce 12,000 votes after they had already run 3 audits and certified the election.
right.
So Raffensperger is presented as a hero, an election protection guy.
Yeah.
And this is what gets so twisted in our corporate media, because they won't honor Greg Palast's work by inviting him on MSNBC
Mm-hmm.
and saying, Greg, what happened in Georgia? And CNN will never do that. Fox will certainly never do that.
No.
And so a lot of honest and accurate information is suppressed and kept out of circulation. And this is just one example of that.
Yes, indeed.
And when YouTube notified me that they had pulled the podcast, I went to YouTube and I looked up the Dinesh D'Souza. It's a mockumentary. He calls it a documentary about the mules.
Mm-hmm.
Was it 2,000 Mules, I think it's called?
Yes,
And
the
not
where,
only-
where they were supposedly stuffing boxes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with mail-in ballots.
Right.
The illusion that mail-in ballots are just like, direct mail coupons come to your house,
Right.
and you can use as many as you want and get, $1 off Haagen-Dazs. It's a joke, because if you mail in an absentee ballot, they actually check it with your signature, with your history, and it's only counted if it all matches up.
Right.
At any rate, 2,000 Mules, not only the movie, the trailer, interviews with Dinesh D'Souza, and merchandise. You could buy a T-shirt or a hat on YouTube, and YouTube would take a share of the profits for election disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And they pulled my Palast interview accusing me of misinformation.
Right, which of course is the actual most solid information you could possibly get is off of Palast for election results here in America.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, I very much appreciate the fact that you are there, with all the years of archives you've got there, and that you're still here, more than happy to talk with us about what's going on and present what actually is solid and thorough analysis of the facts that's present underlying the media hype, shall we say.
Aldous, it's my pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much. And again, that's peterbcollins.com to go check out those archives. And in the meantime, you've been listening to TMI with Aldous Tyler. We'll be right back.